Hey, what's up guys, CodeForge here, welcome to the next video. Today we'll build a one-to-many relationship for our web service. We'll start with creating two entities. One of them will be the cart entity and the second one will be the item entity. The cart entity will be the owning side and we'll be able to add different items to our carts. After creating one-to-many relationship, we will move forward and we'll build the service layer where our logic will live, and after that we'll build the REST part. So at the end we'll be able to call different endpoints to perform operations on our entities. Okay, so this is our project setup. Of course we'll use Java Spring Boot, and the most important part over here is the right side, which are the dependencies. We'll use the Spring Web, so we'll be able to create REST endpoints. We'll also use Spring Data JPA, so we'll be able to create entities and create a relationship between them. For testing our database layer, we will use the H2 in-memory database. And at the end, we have the Lombok dependency, which is a Java annotation library. And basically, it will speed up our development process. And if you don't know what the Lombok is, I have a separated video on my channel, so you can learn there how to install it in your Spring Boot project and how to use it and what are the most important or useful annotations. And also regarding the one-to-many relation, there is also a video where I'm explaining step by step how to build such a relationship. Okay, so I think we are ready. Everything is covered, so we can generate the project and import it in the Intellij. Let's go. Okay, project is imported, so in the first place we would like to navigate to the source, main, resources, and over here we would like to open application properties file. Over here I will paste some properties which we are using in almost every video related to the JPA. And if you don't know what's going on over here, I encourage you to check out the video with the H2 setup where I'm explaining those properties. And now to build our relationship, we will need entities, so let's create them. We will go to the Java and we'll open our main package, and over here we'll create a new package which we'll call model. And inside we will create two classes, one for each entity. So we want to right click it, select new Java class, and the first one will be called cart and the second one will be called item. Let's start with the cart class, and first thing we have to do is to mark it as the entity, and to do it we have to use the entity annotation. We'll also use the table annotation to specify the name of the table which will be created for this entity. We have to import it and we'll give it a name of cart. Our cart entity will need the primary key, and to create one we have to use the ID annotation, and we'll also use the generated value annotation, and we'll set the strategy to the generation type auto. And of course we want to put it on the field, so we'll create a private long field with the name ID. Our card will have also name, so we'll go and create another property, so it will be private string and we'll call it name. Now we would like to store items in our cards, and to do it we'll create a private property which will be the type of list. And this list will store objects of type item. So we have to provide item over here and import list. We'll call this property items, and we'll also assign memory to it. So it will be new array list. But it's not everything. We also have to mark our items collection with the one-to-many annotation. And also we'll specify the cascade type and we'll set it to the cascade type all. So each operation performed on the card will be cascaded to the items. So if we will delete the card which stores, let's say 2 items, the card will be deleted together with those 2 items. We'll also specify the join column name by using join column annotation, and we'll set the name of it to cart underscore ID. So thanks to that, in the item table, we'll have the cart ID column, and this cart ID column will tell us to which cart the specific item is assigned. Our entity is not ready yet because we will also need the default constructor, and to create one we'll hit Alt Insert, we'll select constructor, and from here we'll select none. We'll also need two methods, one for adding items to the items collection and one for removing them. So let's create them. We'll go to the bottom, and over here we'll say public void, and the first one will be called add item, and it will accept the item object as the argument. And all we have to do inside is to use our items collection and call add. And here we'll pass the item object which we'll receive. Now we want to remove the items, so let's go to the bottom and we'll say public void. This time it will be remove item. And again we will get the argument, that is the type of item. And we want to access our items collection which stores the items, and we want to call the remove method. And we want to pass the item object as the argument. Before we will move to the item entity, we will also mark the card with the data, so the getters and setters and also constructors will be generated for this entity. And by the way, it's the Lombok annotation. Okay, so let's move to the item entity. In the first place, we will mark it with the data annotation. It will be useful or later, and now we'll mark it with the entity also, and we'll specify the table name and we'll set the name to the item. We'll also need the primary key, so we'll use the ID together with the generated value, and we'll set the strategy to auto. We want to put it on the private long ID field. Each item will also have the serial number, so we'll say private string and we'll call this field serial number. And this is pretty much everything regarding the properties. We'll also generate the default constructor for the Hibernate. For now it's good, so we can move on and create our new package in our main package, and it will be repository. Repositories allow us to perform the operations on our entities, like retrieving them from the database, saving them to the database, or deleting them. So we'll need one repository for each entity. So we want to right click the package, select new Java class. This time it will be interface, and the first one will be cart repository. Let's also create the second one for the item. So again, we select interface, and it will be item repository. All we have to do over here is to mark our interface with the repository annotation, and also we have to say that our item repository extends CRUD repository, which is the generic type, and we have to specify for which entity we are creating this repository. So in this case it will be the item, and we have to import it, and as the second part we have to specify the type of the primary key, and this is it. We have to do the same for the card repository. So again we will mark it with the repository annotation. We want to say extends CRUD repository, but this time we want to create it for the card, and the type of the primary key is also long. Now we will create the service layer, so we want to right click on our main package, select new package, and we'll call it service. Inside we would like to create two classes, one for each entity. So we select Java class, and first one will be card service, and the second one will be item service. Let's start with the item service. In the first place, we will mark it with the service annotation. So Spring will create a bin for this class. Our item service will have one field and it will be private final. It will be the type of item repository with the same name. And now we would like to inject this field to our item service. So to do it, we'll generate a constructor with this specific field. And also let's mark it as the auto-wired. Over here we are using something that is called dependency injection in the Spring. So Spring will inject the item repository bin to our item service. Thanks to that, we'll be able to use item repository methods in our item service class. Now we have to create several methods, so we will be able to perform CRUD operations on our item entity. And the CRUD stands for create, read, update, delete. And in the first place, we'll take care of creating the items. To do it, we'll create a public method which will return the item, because it is nice to return the object after creating it. And the method name will be addItem, and it will accept item object as the argument. And all we have to do to persist our item object into the database is to say return, and we want to call item repository.save item. And as you can see over here, we are using the item repository, which is injected by the Spring, and thanks to that you can call the save method to save our item entity. And after that we are returning the persisted object. And now we would like to take care of R, which is read. So we'll create the method that will return all of the items from the database. So we'll say public. And since we will be returning all items, we'll return the list of them. So we want to say list item, and we probably have to import it. And we'll call this method getItems. And let's scroll it down. Now to get all of the items, we have to say return. And again, we will use item repository, which is our layer that communicates with the database, and we'll call findAll method. And it should return all of the items from the database, but as you can see, we are getting an error here because the required type is list item, which is specified over here, and the findAll method will return the iterable. So now we have to convert the iterable into the list. To do it, we'll use the stream support. So we'll say stream support over here, and we'll call the stream method to create a stream out of our item repository findAll result. But this stream works on the splitterator, so we have to call the splitterator method on our findAll result. As the second argument of the stream method, we can specify if the returned stream will be sequential or parallel. And we want to make it sequential, so we have to pass false. And the last thing we have to do over here is to collect the result of the stream. So we have to say .collect, and we can see that we are passing collectors to list because we want to convert the stream to list. Okay, so we can retrieve the list of the items. It would be also nice to retrieve one specific item in the case when the user would like to check the details of this one specific item. So we will go over here and we'll say public, and we'll return the item, of course, and our method will be called getItem this time. And we can get item by ID, so our method will accept argument that is the type of long, and the name will be ID. Finding an item is really easy. In the first place, we'll say return, and again we'll use our database access layer, which is item repository for this specific entity, and we'll call the find by ID method. And over here we'll simply pass ID. But as you can see, we are getting an error, and this is because the find by ID method is not returning the item but the optional item. So item with this ID may not exist on our database. When the findById method will not find the specific item, we can throw an error. So we can call or else throw method, and we can pass the lambda expression. And this lambda expression will create a new runtime exception. But this runtime exception is not a really meaningful one, so we'll create our own exception. We'll go to the model package, we will right click it, select new package, and we'll say exception over here. We'll call our new exception CRUD not found exception. So the first thing our exception has to do is to say extends runtime exception. And now we'll create a constructor, so it will be public CRUD not found exception, and it will accept ID. And inside our CRUD not found exception constructor, we'll call the super constructor from the runtime exception, and we'll pass the message there. So we will use the message format to format the message, and we'll call the format method. And now we'll provide the pattern, so it will be could not find CRUD with ID, and we'll use the placeholder here, and as the second argument of the format method we'll pass the ID. And this is our exception. So now we can go back to our item service, and instead of throwing runtime exception, we can throw our CRUD not found exception, and we can pass the ID. So we will have a meaningful error. Now we would like to take care of the delete method. So again, it will be public. We'll return item because it's also a nice practice to return the deleted item. So it will be the delete item, and of course we can delete it using ID. So in the first place, we have to check if this specific item exists on the database, because we cannot delete something that does not exist. So we will say item to create an object, and we'll call our existing method from the service, which is getItem, and we'll pass ID. And our getItem method, which we have created a second ago, will make a validation, because if it will not find the item itself, and the error will be thrown. So it is good to go. And now if the item will be found, we want to simply delete it. So we want to call item repository dot delete, and we want to pass the item. And now we can simply return the item. And the last thing we want to do is to edit the item, and it will be easy because our item entity has only one field, which is the serial number. So now again we want to say public item, and it will be called edit item, and we will accept ID and the item. So the first parameter of this method, long ID, will be used to retrieve existing item from the database, and the second parameter, which is the item, will be used to update the existing item. So in the first place, we have to check if the item exists on the database, and if it's there, we have to retrieve it. So we'll create an item type variable with the name item to edit, which will store the reference to the object. And we want to do the same what we have did in the delete item method, so we'll call the get item method. So we'll pass ID, and thanks to that we will have again a validation, because if the item with the specific ID will not be found, the get item method will throw an error. And now we would like to update our item. It will be pretty easy because we have only one field. So in the first place, we want to use the item to edit object retrieved from the database. And we want to call the setSerialNumber method. And by the way, this setSerialNumber method comes from the Lombok. It's generated by the Lombok. And as we can see over here in the item, we don't have any setter. This is because this annotation generates it. Okay, so let's go back over here. And all we have to do is to call the item, and the same goes for the getSerialNumber. It is also generated by the Lombok. So basically, we are retrieving the serial number from the incoming item object, which is the new object, and then we are setting it on our existing object to update the serial number. And thanks to that, item to edit is attached, or also called managed entity. We don't have to explicitly save it. So all we have to do over here is to say return item to edit, and our changes will be persisted. Okay, so this is all regarding this item service. I have to fix one more thing over here. You probably already seen this. I have created card not found exception, which definitely makes no sense over here. So of course it should be item not found exception. So let's quickly refactor it. We can right click on our exception, select refactor, rename, and we'll change the card to the item. We'll hit enter. We can see that the name over here has been changed, also over here. And let's also navigate over here, and we'll change the message, so it will be could not find item instead of card. And now we can go back to item service, and now it's good. We can move on to the card service and take care of this one. So in the first place, we'll mark it with the service annotation. This class will have two dependencies. First one will be for the card repository, because we will be working a lot with the card entities. And also we'll need a dependency to the item service, because we will have to take care of adding items to the card and removing them. Let's generate the constructor for it. So we want to hit Alt, Insert, Constructor. We want to select both of them, and we want to hit enter. We'll also add the auto-wired annotation. Like in the case of items, we will need the method to add new cards. So we'll say public, it will return the card, and the name of the method will be add card. We have to import the card type, and we'll accept a card object as the argument. And we can simply say return card repository dot save, and we can pass the card as the argument. So it is almost the same like in the case of items. Same goes for retrieving all cards from the database. So let's maybe copy this method from here. So we'll copy this, we'll paste it in the card, and of course we'll change the type from the list item to the list card. We'll change the name of the method to the get card, and we of course want to use the card repository instead of item repository, and the rest stays the same. Oh, we'll add the S at the end over here. Next method will be related to retrieving the specific card. So we will say public card, because we will be returning the card object, get card, and of course we want to retrieve the card by ID. So we'll have the argument type of long with the name ID. And to find it, we'll say return card repository find by ID, and we'll pass the ID as the argument. And of course, like in the case of the items, we'll throw an error if the specific card will not be found. So we'll use the lambda expression over here and we'll throw new runtime exception. But like in the case of items, it's better to create a specific exception. So we will go over here, right click on the exception package and create new class. And this time it will be card not found exception. So in the first place, we'll extend runtime exception, and the constructor part will copy from the item not found exception. So I will grab this and we'll paste it over here. We have to change the name of the constructor, of course, and the message, so it will be not item but card. And we can go back to our card service, and instead of throwing runtime exception, we want to throw card not found exception and pass the ID. Now we would like to delete cards, so it will be public card delete card method, and we'll accept ID. And in the first place, you would like to check if the card exists, and if it does, we would like to retrieve it. So we'll create a variable with the type card, which will store the reference. So it will be card, and we want to call the getCard method and pass the ID. And just like before, the getCard method will take care of finding the specific card, and if it does not exist, the cards not found exception will be thrown. And if the card exists, we want to say card repository dot delete, and we want to pass the card object. At the end, we can simply return it by saying return card. And the last method, which we will use for editing the card. So we'll start with the public, and we will return the card, and the name of the method will be edit card. And we'll have two arguments. First one to find the specific card, and the object card with the new values. So in the first place, we would like to find the specific card. So again, we'll create a variable that will store the reference, and we'll call it card to edit, and we'll call the getCard method, and we'll pass the ID. And now we would like to update the name of the card. So we want to say card to edit, and now to set a new name, we want to say set name, and we want to update it with the value that comes from the card get name. And the last thing we want to do is to return updated object. So we want to say return card to edit. And we don't have to explicitly save card to edit because it's the managed entity, or also called attached entity. Okay, so we have the CRUD functionality for our card entity, and now we would like to take care of adding items to the card and removing them. So we'll go over here and we'll say public card, because we want to return the card after adding the item to it. And we'll call the method add item to card, and we'll have two IDs over here. So we'll say long card ID, and also we'll have long item ID. So to add item to the card, first we have to retrieve the card itself, and we'll do it the way like we did it in the case of deleting the card and editing. So we are creating the type of card variable with the name card, which will store the reference, and we'll retrieve the card using getCard method, and we'll pass the card ID. Okay, so we have the card. Now we will also need the item which we want to add. And to do it, we'll create item type variable with the name item. And this time we'll call the item service to access the getItem method. And thanks to that, we can pass the item ID and we can retrieve the item from the database. So we have both sides of the relationship. And now adding item to the cart is pretty straightforward. So we are using the cart object and we want to add new item to the collection of items. And we can simply pass the item, which we also have retrieved from the database. Since the cart entity is managed in this case, we can simply say return cart. The last method that we want to implement is for removing the items from the cart. So we want to say public cart, and this time it will be remove item from cart. And again, we will have two parameters. First one, type of long cart ID, because we have to know from which cart we want to delete the item. And the second parameter, which is the item ID. Again, we have to retrieve the item and the cart, so we will copy those parts and paste it. And now we can remove the item from the cart by using the cart object and calling the remove item method, which we have implemented. And now we can pass the item object. At the end, we would like to return the cart object. So this is all regarding the service layer. Now we can move forward and implement the REST controllers. Let's clear it a little bit. And now we'll create a new package. So we right click, select package, and it will be called controller. We'll have two controllers. First one will be called cart controller. And the second one will be called item controller. Let's start with the item controller. So in the first place, we'll mark it with the REST controller annotation. And also we'll specify the request mapping. So this will be the common part for each of the endpoints, and it will be /items. Our item controller will require one dependency, and it will be the item service. So we want to say private final item service, and this field will have the same name as the type. And now we'll generate the constructor, and we'll mark this constructor with the I2wired annotation. Let's start with creating an endpoint for adding new item. So we'll use for it a post mapping annotation, because we want to use the post request for creating new items. And of course, we want to put this annotation on our method, so it will be public, and we will be returning response entity, which is the generic type, and it will be the wrapper for the item Dto object, which we'll create in a while. And the name of the method will be addItem, and as the argument it will accept the request body. So we'll use the request body annotation over here, and the request body will be final item Dto. So we'll receive item Dto object in the request body. Later on, we'll do some action on it, and after it, we will return the response entity together with our created item. And by the way, DTO stands for the data transfer object. So now let's create the DTO object, and we will create it in the module package, and we'll create a new package inside that will be called DTO. So we'll have a new class that will be called item DTO, and we'll also need DTO for the cart. So we'll create a second one, and it will be called cart DTO. We will start with the item DTO because this is the one we need right now. In the first place, we will mark it with the data annotation from the Lombok. And our DTO will have two fields. First one will be private long ID, and the second one will be private string serial number. It is the same like in our item entity. And our item DTO will have one special method which will allow us to transform item object into the item DTO object. So it will be public static, and we will be returning item DTO. The name of the method will be from, and it will accept item object as the argument. It is a static method because we don't want to create an object to use it. And in the first place, this method will create a new item DTO object. So we'll say item DTO with the same name. So this is the variable that will store the reference. And now we'll use the default constructor to create an empty object. And this default constructor comes from the data annotation from the Lombok. So we have empty item DTO object, and now we want to set its fields. So in the first place, we want to say item DTO, and we want to set ID, and this ID comes from the item get ID, and the same goes for the serial number. So we want to set the serial number for the item DTO. And we can retrieve this serial number from the incoming item object by saying item get serial number. At the end, we can simply return our new item DTO object. So this is the DTO for our item entity. And now we can go back to the item controller and we can import the item DTO. Okay, so we can transform item into the item DTO. But we will also need to transform item DTO into the item. So now we will navigate to the item entity, and over here we will create a very similar method. It will be also public static, but this time you want to return item. The name will be also from, but this time this method will accept item DTO instead of the item. And now we can simply create a new empty item object by saying item and using the default constructor. And now we can say item set serial number, and this serial number will come from the item DTO. So we will say item DTO get serial number. At the end, we can simply return our new item object by saying return item. We need to set up only the serial number because we'll be using this item DTO to item transformation method only in the case when we will be creating or editing a new item. And when we are creating or editing new item, we can change only the serial number. By the way, we don't need this default constructor over here, so we can get rid of it. And this is because it will be auto-generated thanks to that data annotation that comes from the Lombok. And the same goes for the card. So we can also remove this constructor from here because we also have this data annotation. Let's go back to the item controller and we'll finish the implementation of the add item method. So in the first place, we would like to create a variable that will be the type of item, and the name will be the same, and we will store over here the reference to the item object that will be created by the item service. So we want to say item service because we want to create a new item, and we'll call the method from the item service that we have created, and it is add item. And we can see that it accepts item object. So to actually call this method with the item object, we have to use the static method from the item class, which we have implemented, and now we can pass the item DTO. So the incoming item DTO will be converted into the item, and the add item method will be called. So our item object will be created and persisted. After that, we want to say return new response entity, and we will convert back item into item DTO by saying item DTO from item, and as the second argument we'll pass the HTTP status OK. So this is our endpoint for adding items, and now let's take care of retrieving them. So for retrieving, we would like to use getMapping annotation. So it will be HTTP get method used under hood, and we will create a public method, and we will return response entity, and this time it will be the list of item DTOs. So we want to say list item DTO. We have to import the list, and we'll give it a name, and it will be get items. Now let's retrieve the items, and to do it we'll use the item service dependency, and we will simply call the get items method. And we know that this get items method will return the list of the items. We can see it over here. So we have to store these items somewhere. So let's create a list that is the generic type. So we have to say that it will be the list of the items, and we will say that this list will be called items. So now we have to convert each item in the list into the item DTO. In the first place, we'll create a list that will store the collection of the item DTOs. So we want to say list item DTO. And the list will be called items DTO. Now we would like to iterate over the items collection. And for each element in this collection, we would like to call from method from the item DTO class. And to do it, we want to say items. We want to use the stream. And now we can call the method for each element using the map method. Inside the map method, we can specify which function should be called for each element. And over here, we can use the lambda expression, but in this case, we'll use the method reference. And we want to reference the method from the item DTO class. And now we'll use the double colon, and we'll give the name of the method which we want to call. So we want to call the from method from the item DTO class. By the way, this double colon syntax is called range operator. And now the final step is to convert the stream into the list, so we can simply say collect collectors to list. At the end, we can simply say return new response entity, and we want to pass the items DTO collection with the HTTP status OK. Next endpoint on our list is related to getting the specific item. And to do it, again, we'll use the getMapping annotation, but this time we'll specify the value for this getMapping annotation, and it will be set to the ID, like this. Of course, we want to attach this annotation to our method, so it will be public, and we want to return response entity, and we will be returning item DTO. And now the name of the method will be getItem. And now it will accept a path variable. So we want to say path variable, and it will be final long ID. So if you want to accept something as the path variable, like we did it over here, you have to specify the name of this path variable in the getMapping like we did it over here, or on the controller level over here in the request mapping. And now we'll retrieve the item. So first we need the variable which will store the reference to this object, and it will be the type of item with the same name. And now to actually get the specific item, we'll use our item service and we'll call the getItem method. And now we can simply pass the ID that comes from the path. We have the object, so we can simply return it. We want to say return new response entity. And over here, before returning it, we have to convert it into the item DTO. So we want to use the item DTO static method called from, and we want to pass here our item object. And as the HTTP status, we'll send OK. Next on our list is delete endpoint, and we'll use delete mapping annotation to do it. And now we'll create a method which will be public, and we'll be returning response entity, and it will be the item DTO. Method itself will be called delete item, and it will accept path variable like in the case of get item, so we'll copy it and paste it over here. And of course we have to specify the value, so again we'll set it to ID. The body of this method will be almost the same, so we'll simply copy it from the getItem method and we'll paste it in the body of delete item method. The one thing we want to change is to change the method that is called in the item service. So instead of the getItem, we want to call delete item. The last endpoint is the endpoint for editing the item, so we'll use for it the put mapping annotation. And again, we'll specify the value and we'll set it to ID. And we'll of course attach it to our method, which will return the response entity, and it will be an item DTO. And the method will be called edit item. This method will need two things. The first one is the ID, which will be passed as the path variable, and the second one is the request body. In the case of the path variable, we can copy this part of code, and for the request body, we'll say request body, and we want to accept item DTO type with the same name. And let's move it. And now the body of our method, it will be quite simple. First of all, we want to create a variable that will store the reference to the item object, and let's call it this time edited item. And we want to assign to it the result of the item service edit item method. And this edit item method requires ID, which we'll have from the path, and also it requires the item object. And to get item object, we have to use the static method from the item object. So we want to say item from item DTO. And this item DTO will of course come from the request body. And after editing it, we can simply return it. So let's copy the line from delete method and we'll paste it. And we only have to change the item to edited item, and it is good to go. So the next step is to implement the CRUD controller. So let's move there. In the first place, of course, we'll mark it with the REST controller annotation. And also we'll use the request mapping annotation to specify the common path for each endpoint. And it will be /CRUDs. Our controller will need only one dependency, and it will be private final CRUD service with the same name. And we'll also generate a constructor for it, and we'll mark it with the auto-wired annotation. So the first endpoint will be responsible for adding new cards. So like in the case of item controller, we'll use the post mapping annotation, and we'll put it on the method, which will be public, and we'll be returning response entity, but this time we'll be returning a card DTO as the object. And the name of the method will be addCard. And our endpoint will also accept a request body, so we will specify it as the parameter. So we want to say request body, and it will accept final card DTO with the same name. And of course we have to import this class because we have created it earlier, but now we will also implement it. In the first place, we'll mark it with the data annotation from the Lombok, and our card DTO will have the same fields as our card entity. So we'll have private long ID. Also, we'll have private string name. And the last one is private list with the items. So it will be the item type over here, which we have to import, and the same goes for the list. And we'll give it a name items, and we'll assign memory, so it will be new array list. We'll also need the public static method that will allow us to convert a card object into the card DTO object. So it will be public static card DTO. This is the return type, and the name of the method will be from, and we want to accept the card object as the argument. So the parameter will be card. Inside our method, in the first place, we want to create a new card DTO object. So we'll use the default constructor generated by the Lombok, and now we can set specific fields. So in the first place, we want to set the ID, and we can get this ID from the card object. So we want to say get ID. And the same goes for the rest of the fields. So we want to say card DTO set name, and we want to retrieve the name from the card object. And the last one, which is the list of items. So we want to say set items, and from the card object we can get the list of the items. At the end, we want to return our new object. So we want to say return card DTO. So we can convert the card object into the card DTO, but we'll also need to do it from the other way. So we have to create a method that will convert card DTO into the card. So let's move to the card class. Let's zoom it a little bit, and over here at the bottom we want to create a new method. So we want to say public static, and we want to return the card object. This time the name will be from, and we'll accept the card DTO as the argument, like this. So in the first place, we want to create a new card object, and this time we will also use the default constructor. And now we can set a specific field, and in this case we want to set only the name, because when we will create the card, we'll be setting only the name of the card, because it will be empty card, and also ID will be auto-generated. And the value for the name we can get from the card DTO get name. At the end, we can simply return our new object by saying return card. We can go back to the card controller and continue the implementation of the post endpoint. In the first place, we would like to create a variable which would be the type of card with the same name, which will store the reference to the object that will be returned from the card service addCard method. And over here we can use our new method from the card class. So we want to say card from, and we want to pass the card DTO. After creating a new card, we want to return it. So we want to say return new response entity, and we want to convert it back to the card DTO. So we want to say card DTO dot from card, and HTTP status will be OK. Now let's create an endpoint for retrieving collection of the cards. And for that, we will use the get mapping annotation, and we will say public response entity. Since we will be returning the collection, we want to say a list of the card DTOs. And we have to import the list, of course. And the name of the method will be get cards. And also let's go down. And now in the first place we have to retrieve the cards from the database, and we can do it using our service layer. So in the first place we will create a collection that will store the list of cards, and the name will be cards. And now we can use our card service and call getCards method. Like in the case of items, now we have to map each card into the card DTO. So let's go to the item controller and we'll copy this line. And we'll paste it over here. We have to do a few adjustments. So in the first place, we will change the type of our list into the card DTO, and we'll change the name of our list. So it will be cards DTO. Also, we want to use cards collection instead of the items collection. And we want to use the from method, but we want to use it from the card DTO class, not from the item DTO. And now we can simply return it. So we want to say return new response entity, and it will be cards DTO and the OK status. Now let's take care of getting a specific card. And again, we'll use the get mapping annotation, but this time we'll use the value to specify the path parameter, and we want to get the ID in the path. And of course, we want to say public response entity will be returning the card DTO object, and the name of the method will be getCard. And let's go down. Our getCard method has to accept one path variable, so we have to say path variable final long ID. And now we can take care of the body of our method. So in the first place, we'll store our object in the variable, and we want to get it from the card service, and we want to call the getCard method and pass the ID. After this, we can return our object by saying return new response entity, and we have to convert it to the card DTO using from method, and we have to pass the card object and set the status to OK. Deleting the card will be very similar, so let's copy this get method and we'll paste it over here. And all we have to do is to change the mapping to delete mapping. We'll change the name of the method to delete card, and also we'll change the method which will be called on the card service object, and it will be delete card. Rest stays the same, and now we can take care of editing endpoint. So let's again copy this, we'll paste it over here, and we'll change delete mapping into the CRUD mapping. We'll also change the name of the method to the edit card, and we'll extend the parameter list. So we have to add the request body over here. That will be final, and it will be the card Dto object. And of course we have to change the method that is called on the card service object. So we want to say edit card, and we have to pass also the other parameter that has to be converted into the card object. So you have to say card from card Dto. So the CRUD functionality for our card entity is here, but we'll also need two extra endpoints, one for adding items to the card and one for removing items from the card. Let's start with adding, and for this one we'll use the post mapping annotation, and we will specify the path. So we want to say value, and this time we will need two path variables. The first one will be the card ID, because we have to know to which card we want to add the item. And now we'll give it a /items, and we will also pass the item ID, because we have to know which item we want to add. And at the end we'll give the name of the operation, so it will be for the adding the items. And now we want to create a method, so we'll say public response entity, and we'll be returning the card Dto object, and the name of the method will be add item to cart, and it will have two parameters. The first one will be the path variable, which will be final long, and the name will be the card ID. And the second one will be also the path variable, which will be final long, but this time it will be the item ID. Now to add item to the cart, we have to call our card service method, but we of course want to return our card object. So first let's create a variable with the type of card, and now we want to use our card service, and it has the add item to cart method, and we will pass our two path parameters. So in the first place we will pass cart ID, and as the second parameter we'll pass item ID. After adding item to the cart, we want to return the cart with all of the items. So we want to say return new response entity, and inside we have to convert the cart into the cart Dto. So we want to say cart Dto from cart, and the status will be OK. And the last endpoint that we have to implement will be for removing the items from the cart. So we'll copy our adding item logic, and we'll paste it over here, and we'll need to change the post mapping into the delete mapping, and we'll also change the name of the operation, and it will be remove. We also need to change the name of the method, so it will be remove item from cart. And of course we have to change the method that is called in our cart service, so it will be remove item from cart, and the rest stays the same. Okay, so we have created all of the endpoints that our application requires to work. We need to do one more adjustment in the services layer. So let's go to the item service in the first place. And over here, we want to take care of the edit item method. When we were implementing this method, I have said that we don't have to explicitly save the item to edit using the item repository. And it is true, but the class or the method itself must be annotated with the transactional annotation. And if we scroll up, we can see that our item service is not annotated with the transactional. So we'll annotate our method. So we want to add the transactional at the top. And now our edit item will be edited and persisted into the database with the updated serial number. And the same rule applies to the card service. So if we open it up, we can see that our edit card has no transactional annotation, and same applies to the class. So we will go and add the transactional over here. We should also put transactional on our add item to cart method and remove item from cart method. Because also here we are not using the save method from the card repository. So we'll add transactional over here and also over here. And I don't like one thing about the add item to card method, because right now if we will add item to the card and then we will try to add same item to different card, it will be moved from one card to another and we don't like it. So before adding item to the card, first we want to check if this item is already assigned to some card. To do it, we'll need the bidirectional relationship between our entities. Right now it is unidirectional because we have the information about the mapping only in the card entity. So let's add it also in the item. So over here, right under the serial number, we want to add a many-to-one annotation, and we want to put it on the private card type field. Okay, so right now our relationship is bidirectional. And before we will implement our logic, let's first create a proper exception that will be thrown when the item is already assigned to the card. So we want to go to the exception, we want to right click, select new Java class, and our exception will be item is already assigned exception. So over here, we need to extend the runtime exception, and we'll create a constructor for our exception. So it will be public, we'll copy the name, and it will accept two different arguments. So the first one will be the type of long, and it will be item ID, and the second one will be the type of long, but it will be the cart ID. And our arguments should be also final, so let's modify it. And the same should apply here in the card not found exception. This ID here should be final, and in the item not found exception, this ID can also be final. So let's go back to the new exception. Inside our new constructor, we would like to call our parent constructor. To do it, you want to use super, and inside we would like to pass a message which we want to format, and the message will be following. It will be item, and over here we'll put placeholder for the item ID, and we'll say is already assigned to card, and over here we will put placeholder for the card ID. And as the second argument, we will pass item ID, and as the third argument, it will be card ID. And of course, we need a semicolon at the end. Okay, I think we have everything we need, so we can go back to the cart service. And over here in the add item to cart method, right before the add item operation, we want to put if statement. In the condition, we would like to check if the item is assigned to the cart, and we can do it in the following way. We will use the objects class and we'll call a static method non-null, and we want to check if the cart from the item object is not null. So we can do it by saying item get cart. If that condition is true, that means the item is already assigned to some cart, and in this case we would like to throw a new error. So we want to say throw new, and it will be item is already assigned exception. And as the argument, we have to pass item ID. And the second one is the cart ID, and we can get it from the item get cart get ID. Let's move it to the another line and the semicolon at the end. Okay, so now we are safe and it is not longer possible to steal an item and put it in the another cart. There is one more thing I want to change before we'll test it. So let's go to the DTO, and over here let's navigate to the cart DTO. And over here we can see that our cart DTO has a field which is the type of the list item. And it is not really okay if the DTO object is using the entity as the field. So we'll change the item into the item DTO. To do it, we will change the type in the list. So it will be item DTO. And we will also change the name of the field. So it will be items DTO. And now we have to iterate over the list of the items from the cart object, and we have to transform each of them into the item DTO. And this operation sounds familiar, so let's go to the item controller, and I think we can grab this one over here. So let's copy it and let's go back to the cart DTO. And we can simply paste it over here after the get items call. And we can also change the set items into the set items DTO. And it's good. So now instead of returning item collection with the cart DTO, we are returning the collection of the items DTOs. Also, we would like to add just the item DTO class. Between the cart and item entity, we have a bidirectional relationship. And it would be also nice to have information about the cart DTO in the item DTO. This information will be really useful in the case when, for example, on the UI, you would like to display only the items that are not already assigned to any cart. And the problem here is that if the item will be added to the cart, and we'll have the reference from the cart DTO to the item DTO and from the other way around, we'll get an infinite loop during the serialization. So we'll create a new DTO in the DTO package that will be called plain cart DTO. And it will be a little bit different from the cart DTO. So in the first place, let's mark it with the data annotation, and the first field will be private long ID, and the second one will be string name. And if we will compare our plain cart DTO with the cart DTO, we can see that we are skipping this collection of items DTOs. So thanks to that, we'll avoid the infinite loop during the serialization. We'll need over here the method that will convert cart into the plain cart. So we will say public static, and we would like to return the plain cart DTO. The name of the method will be from and will accept CRUD object as the argument. Inside, in the first place, we would like to create a new plain CRUD Dto object. So we want to say new plain CRUD Dto. And now we'll set the fields. So for the plain CRUD Dto, we would like to set ID. And we can retrieve this ID from the incoming CRUD object. And the same goes for the name. So we want to access the plain CRUD Dto and set the name. And we can retrieve it from the CRUD. At the end, we can return our new object. So we want to say return plain CRUD Dto. Okay, so we can go back to the item Dto, and under the serial number field, we would like to say private plain CRUD Dto with the same name. Also, we have to adjust our from method. And in the first place, we would like to use the if statement. And inside, we would like to again use the objects class. And we want to use non-null static method. And inside, we would like to access the item object and check if the get card will return null or not. If it's not null, inside we can say item Dto set plain CRUD Dto. And now we can use our new from method from the plain CRUD Dto class, and we can pass over here the card from the item. And we have to make this check because it is possible that item is not assigned to any card. And if we will perform this operation when the item is not assigned to any card, we will get a null pointer exception. So now we are ready to test everything, and to make it easier, we'll open the pom.xml and we'll add the Swagger UI documentation to our project. So over here in the dependencies section, we want to add a new dependency entry. So it will be dependency, and the artifact will be Spring Fox boot starter from the IO Spring Fox, and it will be version 3. We'll also click this Maven load changes button over here, and we are ready to build our project. So we want to go to the Maven, and we want to go to the lifecycle, and over here we will click install. And I will stop the video and start again when it's done. We got the build success message, so now we can go to the plugins, Spring Boot, and we can say Spring Boot run to start our application. And after it will start, we will open the web browser on the localhost port 8080. Application is up and running. As I said, we are on the localhost port 8080. And we can access the Swagger UI documentation on the path /swagger-ui/index.html. In the first place, let's test out the CRUD for the item entity. So we want to open item controller, and we can find our methods over here. So in the first place, we would like to add a new item. So we want to select the post, try it out, and over here we don't need those stuff, and we'll leave only the serial number, and we'll set it to S1, and we'll click execute. And we can see that our object has been created. So now let's change the name. We need the put method over here. The ID of our item was 1. So we want to put it over here, and we'll change the serial number to the S2. We want to click execute, and we can see that the serial number is different now. And now let's try to use the get by ID endpoint. So we want to open this one over here, execute, and we can see it's over here. Let's add another item. So we go over here, and this time we'll add S3. And now we can get the entire collection of items. We want to try it out, execute, and we can see that we have 2 entries. Let's delete one with the ID 2. So we want to go here, delete, and we want to put 2 over here, execute. The object has been returned, but let's make sure. So we'll open get all items, endpoint, execute, and we have only 1 entry. Now let's create a card. So we want to open card controller, and we want to go over here, try it out. We'll need only the name, so it will be C1. It's here, so let's add another one. It will be C2, execute, and it's here. Let's get all the cards, try it out, execute, and we can see there is our collection of cards. Let's edit the one with the ID 4, so we want to find the put endpoint, and the ID was 4. And we want to change the name to, let's say, C4, execute, and we can see it is the new name right now. So let's go to the endpoint that allows us to retrieve the specific card by ID. We'll put 4 over here, and we can see it is C4. Now let's try to add item to the card. So we'll go over here, and we want to open this one. And now we have to provide the card ID. Let's add it to the one we have edited. So it will be 4, and the item ID was 1. And now let's execute it. And we can see that our plain card DTO is null right now, which is not true, because the item is already assigned to the card with the ID 4. So let's go back to the code and let's fix this one. So our problem is located over here in the add item to card method. So after checking the condition and adding item to the card, we also have to set the card for the item object. So we want to say item, set card, and we want to say card over here. So let's restart the application and we'll try it again. Okay, here we are. Let's quickly create a new item and cards. So we will go over here, we'll add new item, and it will have S1 serial number, and we can see it has been created and it has ID 1. So now let's create cards. We will have 2 cards. So we want to add them over here, and it will be card 1, execute, it's over here, and also card 2, execute, and it's over here. So now let's add item to the card. So we'll add it to the card with the ID 2, and the item ID was 1. We want to click execute. And we can see that now everything is set correctly. So let's also check if it's possible to add the same item to the different card. And we'll change the card ID to 3. We'll click execute. And we can see that it is not possible because we are getting the internal server error. And in the logs of our application, we probably received a message that the item 1 is already assigned to card with the ID 2. Let's test a few more things. So in the first place, let's return the collection of cards. We can see it's correct over here. We have 1 item for the C1 card. And let's also check out the item controller, and let's return the collection of items. And you can see we have only 1 item that is assigned to C1 card. Let's try to remove the item from the card. So we'll go over here, the card ID was 2 and the item ID was 1. So we want to click execute. We can see that now the C1 card is empty, but let's make sure. So we'll retrieve the collection of the cards, and it is also empty over here. Okay guys, so this is it. This is how you want to create an API for your one-to-many relationship. It was a lot of coding and also a lot of testing, but of course we have also learned a lot of things. I encourage you to get familiar with this code, to play a little bit with the endpoints, so you will get a better understanding how it works. Thank you for watching. Remember about subscribing to the channel and liking the videos. See you next time. Bye.